Night does not arrive loudly in a medieval home. It lowers itself gently like a careful guest, counting the cost of every flame and reminding everyone that staying awake is never free. Before you drift any deeper, if this quiet helps you feel safe tonight, you're welcome to stay with us. Subscribing softly keeps this place gentle and lets these nights continue. Now, rest. When night fell indoors in a medieval home, it did not announce itself with a switch or a clock or a glowing screen that insisted it was still early. It arrived the way most things did in the past, gradually, without permission, and with a quiet authority that did not need explanation. The sun slipped below the horizon. Shadows lengthened across walls that had learned this movement by heart. Doors were closed, not for drama, but for warmth, habit, and the simple understanding that the outside world had become less useful for a while. Inside, the house changed character. During the day, it had been a place of motion, sound, and practical noise. Feet moved, tools scraped, voices crossed one another in short exchanges meant to get through work. At night, the same space became careful. Movements slowed. Words stretched out or disappeared altogether. The house was no longer a workshop. It was a container for light, heat, and people who did not wish to waste either. There was no electricity to flatten the difference between day and night, no uniform brightness to erase shadows. Darkness was not an absence, but a presence, something that settled into corners, under tables, behind chests, and along ceiling beams. It did not feel threatening most of the time. It felt familiar, like a neighbor who never knocked because they were always there. The only thing that pushed back against it was flame. And flame came at a price. An oil lamp was not a background detail. It was a decision. Someone had gathered the fuel earlier, whether oil pressed from plants, rendered animal fat, or some local substitute that smelled faintly of its origin. Someone had prepared the wick, trimmed it, adjusted it, and placed the lamp where it would do the most good while doing the least harm. Light was not spread evenly. It was aimed. A table, a pair of hands, a narrow circle, where something still needed to be finished before sleep finally claimed the room. This meant that night was not designed for activity. It tolerated a little of it, reluctantly. The medieval home understood something modern homes tend to forget, which is that staying awake is a form of spending. Each extra hour cost fuel. It cost eye strain. It cost attention. And attention, once lost to fatigue, was not easily recovered the next morning, when work resumed, whether one felt ready or not. There were no precise clocks ticking away the minutes. Time was measured by sensation, by how heavy the eyelids felt, by how small the flame had become, by the way conversations thinned, until silence no longer felt awkward, but necessary. Night did not need to be managed. It managed people instead, nudging them toward stillness with gentle persistence. This is where the modern imagination often goes wrong. We tend to think of the past as either endlessly busy or dramatically fearful after dark. In reality, most medieval nights were neither exciting nor terrifying. They were economical. They were practical. They were designed to end as soon as reasonably possible so that tomorrow could begin without unnecessary damage. A medieval home after sunset was not trying to create atmosphere. It was trying to survive comfortably. The humor of this becomes clearer when we realize how little effort was spent making nights memorable. There were no plans to stay up late for the sake of it. No one thought of night as a canvas for productivity or self-improvement. If something could wait until morning, it usually did, and many things could. The house itself cooperated in this quiet negotiation. Its layout assumed darkness. Furniture stayed where it belonged because rearranging it would invite bruises and frustration. Paths between doorways, tables, and sleeping spaces were worn smooth by repetition, memorized by feet rather than eyes. The home did not expect to be seen clearly at night. It expected to be known. Sound took on new importance. A cough, the creak of a bench, the low murmur of voices carried further once the world outside fell silent. People recognized one another by rhythm and habit rather than sight. The house became a small acoustic universe, enclosed and predictable, which was exactly what it needed to be. Even the air felt different. The smell of oil and warm wood settled into fabrics and hair. Smoke from the lamp hung lightly, never quite leaving. This was not romantic, but it was accepted. Comfort did not mean cleanliness in the modern sense. It meant familiarity. A smell you recognized was a smell that did not require concern. There is something quietly ironic about how disciplined these nights were without ever being moralized. No one preached about going to bed early for virtue. The lesson was taught by cold floors, dim light, and the knowledge that tomorrow's work would not be impressed by last night's ambition. Night enforced limits without speeches. And yet within those limits there was calm. A particular kind of calm that came from knowing there was nothing urgent left to do. The day had run out of light. The house had shifted modes. This was not failure. It was design. If someone read, they read slowly. If someone spoke, they chose their words carefully. If someone sat in silence, it was not considered empty time. It was simply the night doing what it was meant to do, which was to reduce the world to a manageable size. In this sense, the medieval home after dark was honest. It did not pretend to offer endless possibilities. It offered rest. It offered continuation. It offered a pause that was not dramatic enough to be remembered, but effective enough to be repeated every evening for generations. This introduction does not lead toward a climax. It leads inward into the rhythms that shaped ordinary lives, far more than wars or crowns ever did. Because if we want to understand how people truly lived, we have to sit with them in the moments when nothing impressive was happening, when the lamp burned low, when the house grew quiet, when the night was not something to conquer, but something to get through gently without spending more than one could afford. That is where this story begins. The oil lamp as a luxury, not a given. In a medieval home, light did not belong to the room by default. It had to be invited in, negotiated with, and paid for long before night ever arrived. An oil lamp was not an accessory sitting patiently on a shelf, waiting to be noticed. It was the visible end of a long chain of labor that began in fields, kitchens, workshops, and slaughter yards, and every time it was lit, that entire chain quietly presented its bill. Oil did not appear magically in a container. It was pressed, rendered, collected, strained, stored, and guarded. Animal fat came from animals that had to be fed through winter, butchered at the right time, and used fully because waste was not an option. Plant oils required land, harvests, and tools. Even the wick, The most unassuming part of the lamp demanded attention. It had to be made from the right fibers, twisted properly, trimmed often, and replaced when it burned unevenly. A poorly cut wick wasted fuel, smoked excessively, and reminded everyone nearby that negligence had a smell. Because of this, lighting a lamp was never casual. There was no equivalent of turning something on simply because the room felt dull. A flame meant intention. Someone had decided that what was about to happen was worth the cost of making darkness retreat for a while. Sometimes that decision was practical, such as finishing a task that could not wait. Sometimes it was social, allowing a few more words to be exchanged before sleep. And sometimes it was quietly emotional, an unspoken desire to delay the end of the day just a little longer. What is striking is how small the flame usually was. Medieval lamps were not designed to flood rooms with brightness. They created islands of visibility surrounded by shadow. This was not a technological failure. It was an economic one, and economics had the final say. A brighter flame burned fuel faster. A higher wick shortened the night's supply. Light was rationed by design, not ideology. This made people excellent judges of necessity. They knew how much oil remained by weight and by memory. They knew how long a lamp could burn before it demanded attention. They also knew how much effort tomorrow would require, and that calculation always hovered nearby. Staying awake late did not feel rebellious or productive. It felt mildly irresponsible, like spending coins you might need in the morning. There is a quiet irony here. Modern life treats light as neutral and time as precious. Medieval life treated time as abundant and light as precious. Darkness was free, light was not. And so people learned to adapt their evenings to what light could reasonably provide, rather than insisting the environment adapt to their desires. The house itself reflected this understanding. Lamps were placed where their limited reach mattered most, near hands rather than faces, near work rather than decoration. There was no point in illuminating walls or ceilings. Light existed to serve specific actions and nothing more. Everything else could remain in shadow, without complaint. This also meant that social behavior adjusted itself naturally. Conversations slowed because speaking in the dark invited pauses. People listened more carefully, not because they were virtuous, but because the environment demanded it. The lamp did not encourage performance, it encouraged efficiency. Say what needs to be said before the flame shrinks further. Children learned this early. They grew up understanding that light was not a background condition. It was a resource like bread or firewood. Wasting it felt vaguely embarrassing, as if one had failed to notice the limits everyone else accepted without discussion. No one scolded extravagance loudly. The lamp itself did that by burning too fast. There is also something quietly humorous about how unimpressed the medieval lamp was by ambition. Grand plans dissolved quickly under weak light. Reading too much strained the eyes. Detailed work became clumsy. Even storytelling lost momentum when faces could barely be seen. The lamp did not care about enthusiasm. It cared about physics and fuel. This was not deprivation in the dramatic sense. People were not constantly longing for brighter nights. They simply lived within what was available. In fact, the predictability of dim evenings created a form of comfort. Expectations were low, and so disappointment rarely appeared. No one sat under a flickering flame thinking the night had failed them. The night was doing exactly what it always did. What the oil lamp truly changed was behavior, not mood. It shaped evenings into something quieter, shorter, and more focused. It gently discouraged excess without forbidding it. And that gentle pressure, applied every night for centuries, produced habits that felt natural rather than enforced. From a modern perspective, it is tempting to frame this as limitation, but for the people living it, it was simply reality. A lamp was not a symbol of progress or poverty. It was a tool that did one job well enough and no more. And because it demanded care, it earned respect. By the time the flame was lit, most of the day's decisions had already been made. The lamp was not there to extend possibility. It was there to guide the transition toward rest. Its light did not promise more. It reminded everyone that enough had already happened. And when the wick finally burned low and the oil thinned, no one argued with it. The lamp had spoken. The day was over. Darkness as the default setting. In a medieval home, darkness was not an interruption to normal life. It was normal life. Light was the exception, borrowed briefly and returned as soon as it had done its work. When the flame dimmed or disappeared, nothing was considered broken. The house had simply returned to its preferred state, which was shadowed, quiet, and entirely familiar to the people inside it. Modern minds often imagine darkness as something that happens when technology fails. For medieval households, darkness was the baseline condition from which brief moments of visibility occasionally emerged. No one asked why it was dark. The question, if there was one at all, was why it was still light enough to bother staying awake. This meant that the human body adapted in subtle but important ways. Vision was never expected to be perfect at night. People did not strain to see clearly across a room because clarity was not the goal. Instead, they learned to recognize shapes, movement, and distance without demanding detail. The eye adjusted not to brightness but to absence. Shadows were not obstacles. They were part of the architecture. Hearing quietly took over. In low light, sound carried authority. A footstep on packed earth or wood was enough to identify who was moving. The shift of fabric signaled intention. A cough announced presence without requiring a glance. The house at night became less visual and more acoustic, a place where listening mattered more than looking. Movement slowed naturally, not out of fear but out of efficiency. Quick motions invited mistakes, and mistakes in the dark were irritating rather than dramatic. A stubbed toe wasted more energy than it deserved. So people learned to move with memory rather than speed, following paths they had walked since childhood. The body knew where things were even when the eyes did not confirm it. Furniture did not surprise anyone because it rarely moved. The room did not change layout because change was inconvenient in darkness. Stability was not aesthetic. It was practical. A familiar obstacle was safer than an improved one. The medieval home valued predictability far more than novelty, especially after sunset. There is a quiet humor in how unimpressed darkness was by human preference. It did not respond to moods. It did not brighten for conversation or retreat for comfort. It simply remained. And because it remained consistently, people stopped negotiating with it. They did not treat darkness as an adversary to be defeated, but as a condition to be accommodated. This accommodation reshaped social behavior. Gestures became smaller because no one could see them clearly. Facial expressions mattered less. Words carried more weight because they did not compete with visual distractions. Silence was not awkward because it did not feel empty. It felt appropriate. Even emotional states softened under low light. Darkness made drama feel inefficient. There was little point in exaggerated reactions when no audience could fully observe them. Conflicts did not disappear, but they tended to quiet down with the room. Night was not the time for escalation. It was the time for continuation, and continuation favored calm. Children grew into this environment without instruction. They learned early that nighttime was not designed for exploration, not because it was forbidden, but because it was unrewarding. Darkness offered no spectacle. It offered familiarity, and familiarity, repeated every evening, became comforting rather than limiting. The idea of half-light was central. Most medieval nights were not completely black. They were dim, uneven, and localized. A faint glow from a hearth, a small flame guarded carefully, moonlight leaking through gaps in shutters. This half-light did not aim to reveal everything. It revealed just enough, and that was sufficient. People did not feel deprived by what they could not see because they had never expected to see it. The modern desire to illuminate every corner would have felt excessive, even suspicious. Why reveal what does not need to be revealed? Why make the night resemble the day when the entire point of night was to slow down? The house itself seemed to agree. Walls absorbed sound. Low ceilings trapped warmth. Small windows limited exposure to the outside darkness, turning it into something distant rather than intrusive. Indoors, night was controlled not by light, but by enclosure. This is where our assumptions about fear need adjusting. Medieval darkness was not automatically frightening. It was predictable. Fear thrives on uncertainty, not on routine. A dark room you know well is far less unsettling than a brightly lit space you do not understand. For most people, the medieval home at night was the safest place available. There is also an irony worth noticing. Darkness, by limiting what could be done, reduced pressure. The inability to see clearly removed expectations of productivity. No one felt obligated to improve themselves by candlelight. The environment quietly insisted that rest was not laziness but alignment with reality. In this way, darkness functioned as a social regulator without rules. It did not punish. It merely declined to cooperate with excess. And that refusal shaped habits more effectively than instruction ever could. The medieval home did not fight darkness because there was no reason to. Darkness belonged there. It had always been there. It would be there tomorrow night as well. The people inside did not need to conquer it. They needed to live alongside it, gently, efficiently, and without complaint. And so the night settled in, as it always did, not as a dramatic event, but as a return to default. The house dimmed, voices softened, movements slowed. Nothing important was lost because nothing important was meant to happen. Darkness did not end the day. It completed it. Furniture that expected darkness. A medieval home did not prepare itself for darkness each evening because it never expected to escape it. The furniture within it was not arranged for display or frequent reinvention. It was arranged for memory. Every bench, chest, table, and sleeping surface assumed that at some point the light would fade and that people would continue moving through the space anyway, guided less by sight than by habit and touch. Sharp edges were not admired. They were tolerated only when unavoidable And even then, they were softened by use, by fabric, by time. Corners were rounded not because medieval craftspeople lacked precision, but because the human body does not negotiate well with angles it cannot see. A bruise earned in daylight was annoying. A bruise earned at night felt unnecessary, almost insulting, as if the furniture had failed to uphold its side of a quiet agreement. Pathways mattered more than symmetry. The space between door and hearth, between hearth and table, between table and sleeping area, was worn smooth by repetition. These routes were not designed on paper. They were carved into the room by feet and familiarity. Once established, they rarely changed. Rearranging furniture in a medieval home was not an expression of taste. It was an invitation to confusion. Objects stayed where they belonged because belonging mattered. A chest was not moved casually because it stored more than possessions. It stored expectation. You reached for it without looking. You stepped around it without thinking. In darkness, thinking slowed you down. The best furniture demanded no thought at all. This stability shaped the emotional tone of night. There was comfort in knowing exactly where everything was. The house did not surprise you. It cooperated. In a world where so many things were unpredictable, from weather to harvest to health, the interior of the home offered one small, reliable system that behaved the same way every evening. Beds and sleeping surfaces were low, not for aesthetics, but for safety and warmth. A fall from a low height in the dark was inconvenient but survivable. A fall from a raised bed was a mistake no one needed. Even the act of lying down was designed to be forgiving, requiring minimal coordination and no dramatic movement. Tables were sturdy and unassuming. They did not invite collision because they did not intrude into space unnecessarily. Their legs were thick, their presence obvious even in dimness. A table that announced itself through touch was far more useful at night than one that looked elegant by day. Chairs were not scattered for convenience. They were placed deliberately and often pushed back against walls when not in use. A chair left carelessly in the middle of a room was not charming. It was a hazard. The medieval home had no patience for decorative obstacles. There is a gentle irony in how little medieval furniture cared about individuality. Pieces were not expected to express personality. They expressed function. They existed to be used, touched, leaned on, and trusted in low light. Any object that failed at this quietly failed altogether. The darkness itself enforced discipline. You could not afford to forget where things were. You could not rely on vision to rescue poor planning. This made the home conservative, in the best sense of the word. It preserved what worked. It resisted change, not out of stubbornness, but because change was inefficient under half light. Children learned these rules by experience rather than instruction. They memorized the room through repeated evenings, learning where to step, where not to reach, where the edges softened and where they did not. The furniture taught them spatial awareness without speaking. Even storage reflected this logic. Items used at night were kept low and accessible. Nothing required searching in the dark. Searching was a daylight activity. At night, the goal was to find nothing unexpected. This approach created a curious form of elegance, not visual elegance, but functional grace. The room worked. It allowed movement without drama. It allowed rest without interruption. It assumed darkness and made peace with it. From a modern perspective, this might feel restrictive. We are accustomed to moving objects freely, reshaping space according to mood or fashion. But that freedom depends entirely on abundant light. Remove the light and flexibility becomes liability. The medieval home understood this intuitively. There is also a subtle humor in imagining how unimpressed medieval furniture would be by modern habits. A chair that is moved daily would feel unreliable. A table that appears in different places would feel untrustworthy. Stability was not boring, it was respectful. At night, when vision surrendered authority, the body relied on memory. Furniture that respected that memory became invisible in the best possible way. It did not demand attention, it did not surprise, it simply existed exactly where it had always been. And in that predictability, the medieval home offered something rare, a space that did not need to be rediscovered each evening, a space that welcomed darkness without complaint, a space that understood that light would leave but life would continue moving through it anyway, slowly, carefully, and without the luxury of mistakes. Evening meals under weak light. Evening meals in a medieval home were not performances, they were conclusions. By the time food reached the table, the day had already begun to loosen its grip, and light had retreated enough to make efficiency more valuable than pleasure. Dinner was early not because people lacked appetite or ingredients, but because darkness does not wait politely while you decide what to eat. The lamp or hearth offered just enough illumination to identify what was in front of you, not enough to admire it. Colors flattened, details softened, food became recognizable by shape, smell, and memory rather than by sight. This alone shaped what was cooked. Meals were designed to be forgiving in poor light, composed of textures that could be eaten without precision, and dishes that did not punish a slightly misjudged bite. Soups, stews, porridges, and thick breads dominated not because medieval people were unimaginative, but because these foods respected the conditions of the evening. They were warm, filling, and difficult to drop. Bones were softened through long cooking. Ingredients were cut large enough to be found easily, but small enough to manage without effort. This was not culinary minimalism. It was environmental intelligence. Eating under weak light encouraged focus. You paid attention to your hands, to the bowl, to the rhythm of lifting and lowering. Meals did not stretch out because lingering had a cost. The flame shrank whether you were finished or not, and while no one was counting minutes, everyone understood that a meal was part of the day's closing, not the opening act of the night. Conversation reflected this. It did not disappear, but it changed speed. Words came slower, with longer pauses between them. No one rushed to speak because there was no visual competition demanding attention. Silence felt natural. It did not interrupt the meal, it accompanied it. Stories told at the evening table were rarely complex. Darkness is unforgiving to elaborate narratives. It asks for simplicity. A familiar anecdote, a short observation, a shared memory that required no explanation. Laughter when it appeared was brief and soft, more a release of breath than a declaration. There is something quietly ironic about how much control the light had over social behavior without anyone acknowledging it. No rule limited conversation length. No custom demanded brevity. The environment simply declined to support excess. And excess, finding no cooperation, gently withdrew. The physical arrangement of the meal also reflected this restraint. People sat close enough to share light and warmth. No one sat far from the flame out of preference. Distance meant invisibility. The table was a practical cluster, not a formal layout. Everyone leaned slightly inward, drawn toward the only illuminated space like a group of planets orbiting a modest sun. Utensils were simple. Spoons dominated because they required less precision. Knives were used carefully and often by touch rather than sight. There was no expectation of elegance. Spilled food was irritating but not shocking. The dark forgave small errors. Children learned table manners differently in this environment. They were not trained to impress an audience. They were trained to manage themselves in limited visibility, keeping food close, moving slowly, listening. These habits did not need constant correction because the conditions reinforced them every evening. Meals ended not with ceremony, but with inevitability. As the lamp dimmed or the fire settled, the table lost its usefulness. You could eat longer technically, but doing so felt unnecessary. The body sensed the transition before the mind articulated it. Hunger had been addressed. Warmth had been shared. There was no reason to insist on more. From a modern perspective, this might sound austere, but within its context, it was comfortable. The predictability of early meals reduced stress. No one wondered whether dinner would stretch late into the night. No one negotiated schedules around it. The day's work determined the meal, and the meal quietly surrendered to the night. There is also a gentle humor in imagining how quickly a modern dinner party would dissolve under these conditions. Long speeches would fade mid-sentence. Elaborate dishes would lose their appeal. Someone would eventually suggest, without saying it aloud, that tomorrow would be a better time for whatever remained unsaid. The medieval evening meal was not about maximizing experience. It was about sustaining life without draining tomorrow. It respected the limits imposed by weak light and found contentment within them. In this way, dinner became less about celebration and more about closure, a moment of gathering before dispersal, a shared pause before rest. The lamp did not bless the meal, it measured it. And when the bowls were cleared and the last bites swallowed, no one felt deprived. The night had done its job. The meal had done its job. The house was ready to grow quieter, and everyone knew that this was not an ending to mourn, but a rhythm that had carried them safely through countless evenings before and would do so again tomorrow, as long as the light lasted just long enough. Sound replaced sight. When light retreated far enough to make vision unreliable, the medieval home did not become blind. It became attentive. The eye stepped back from authority, and the ear quietly took its place, not as a dramatic replacement, but as a practical adjustment that had been rehearsed every night for as long as anyone could remember. In darkness, sound was no longer background. It was structure. It told you where people were, what they were doing, and whether anything had changed. The house did not need to be seen in order to be understood. It needed to be heard. Footsteps were the most obvious markers. Each person had a rhythm shaped by weight, habit, and mood. A familiar step could be recognized instantly, long before the figure attached to it entered the weak circle of light. Children moved differently from adults. Older bodies announced themselves through slower pacing and softer landings. No one needed to ask who was approaching. The floor answered first. Breathing mattered too. In a quiet room, breath carried information. Someone awake breathed differently from someone drifting toward sleep. A steady rhythm suggested rest. An uneven one suggested thought, discomfort, or the effort of staying awake longer than necessary. The body spoke, even when the mouth did not. Furniture contributed its own vocabulary. A wooden bench creaked in a specific way when shifted. A chest lid made a sound that could not be confused with anything else. Chairs complained briefly when moved and then fell silent, satisfied that their role had been acknowledged. These noises were not interruptions. They were confirmations. At night, the medieval home assembled itself as an acoustic map. Each sound occupied a location and a meaning. You knew where the hearth was by its quiet settling. You knew where the table stood because someone brushed past it. You knew where the door was by the change in air when it opened or closed. Sight would have added detail, but sound already provided orientation. This made movement cautious but confident. People did not rush because rushing produced noise that disrupted the map. Quick steps blurred location. Slow movement preserved clarity. In darkness, efficiency favored restraint. Conversation adapted accordingly. Voices lowered not out of secrecy but out of courtesy. Loud speech overwhelmed the delicate balance of information the room relied on. A raised voice erased subtle cues. A softer one allowed them to remain visible in sound. Words were chosen carefully because speaking meant claiming space in the acoustic environment. You did not talk over someone else because overlapping sounds confused the map. Turn-taking emerged naturally, enforced by the limitations of hearing rather than by etiquette. Silence, far from being empty, was useful. It allowed other sounds to surface. The absence of noise sharpened awareness. In silence, you noticed small changes, a shift in posture, a distant creak the moment someone stood up. Silence was not a lack of activity. It was a listening posture. Children grew up fluent in this language without realizing it was a skill. They learned to identify family members before seeing them. They learned where they were allowed to move freely and where caution was required. They learned that noise had consequences, not moral ones, but practical ones. Noise disrupted understanding. There's a gentle irony here. Modern spaces are visually loud and acoustically dull. Medieval homes were visually restrained and acoustically rich. The night reversed priorities. Seeing less meant hearing more, and hearing more meant understanding the space more completely. This also changed emotional awareness. You could tell when someone was uneasy by the way they shifted. You could sense fatigue in the way someone exhaled. These cues did not require interpretation. They were felt instinctively. Darkness made emotional states audible. Fear, when it appeared, did not announce itself through spectacle. It arrived as unfamiliar sound, a noise that did not belong, but most nights offered no such surprises. Familiar sounds repeated themselves faithfully. The house reassured its occupants by sounding exactly as it always had. There is a quiet humor in how thoroughly sound replaced sight without ceremony. No one declared this shift. No one noticed it happening. It simply worked. The eye rested, the ear took over, the body adjusted. The night house did not echo dramatically. It absorbed sound. Walls softened voices. Low ceilings contained noise. This created intimacy rather than amplification. Sounds stayed close, belonging to the people who made them. Nothing traveled far enough to become alarming. This intimacy reduced the need for visual confirmation. You did not need to see someone to know they were still there. You heard them breathe. You heard the floor respond to their weight. Presence did not require proof. Over time, this way of living trained patience. You waited for sounds to clarify rather than demanding immediate answers. You listened before acting. Darkness rewarded those who paused. In this environment, the home was never truly quiet. It was simply readable in a different way. A map drawn not in lines and corners, but in creaks, breaths, and the gentle grammar of shared space. By the time sleep approached, the house softened further. Sounds diminished one by one. Conversation faded. Movement slowed to necessity only. What remained was not silence, but continuity. The steady assurance that nothing was wrong, because everything sounded exactly as it should. And in that soft, familiar soundscape, sight was no longer missed. The night had given the house another way to be known. Reading, but only barely. Reading at night in a medieval home was never casual. It was not a habit performed absent-mindedly or stretched out to fill time. It was a deliberate act weighed carefully against cost, comfort, and consequence. To open a book after sunset meant accepting a small set of inconveniences that everyone understood, without needing to list them. Your eyes would tire sooner than you wished. The lamp would burn faster than planned. The wick would shorten, blacken, and need attention sooner than tomorrow would appreciate. Because of this, reading in the evening was rare, and when it happened slowly. Not slowly in the modern sense of mindful enjoyment, but slowly because the conditions demanded it. Weak light flattened letters and softened ink. Shadows crept into the margins. The page resisted clarity. You did not skim. You negotiated. Manuscripts were not designed for speed, even in daylight. At night, they became even more stubborn. Words blurred at the edges. Lines seemed to drift closer together. The eye worked harder than the mind, and fatigue arrived early, usually long before curiosity was satisfied. This meant that reading was often repetitive by necessity. A sentence might be read twice, not for reflection, but because it refused to settle the first time. A paragraph might be returned to night after night, not because it was profound, but because that was as far as the lamp allowed you to go before insisting on rest. There is a quiet irony in how much patience this environment demanded. Reading was not framed as an escape from the day. It was an extension of it, paid for with the same limited resources. The book did not invite indulgence. It imposed discipline. Many texts were never meant to be read extensively after dark. They were companions to daylight. Night reading was reserved for what could not wait or what mattered enough to justify the expense. A legal text that needed review. A letter that could not be ignored. A familiar passage revisited rather than explored anew. This familiarity mattered. People did not approach books at night expecting discovery. They approached them expecting recognition. Known texts were safer in poor light. You could fill in missing clarity from memory. You could anticipate what came next. Reading became less about information and more about reassurance. For those who read regularly, posture reflected this restraint. The book was held close to the flame, but not too close. Too close meant smoke and damage. Too far meant strain. The body leaned forward slightly, shoulders rounding, as if the reader were listening rather than looking. Reading became a physical negotiation with gravity, flame, and fatigue. Eyes paid the price. Medieval readers were well aware that weak light punished prolonged effort. No one needed medical theory to understand this. The ache arrived reliably. Vision softened. Focus slipped. The lamp did not adapt to your determination. It waited patiently for you to give up. And so many did. Not in frustration, but in acceptance. Tomorrow would be better. Tomorrow would offer stronger light and fewer penalties. Night did not compete with day. It deferred to it. This shaped how knowledge moved through time. Reading was slower, more deliberate, more selective. You did not consume text, you revisited it. Memory carried more weight than access. What you read stayed with you because rereading required effort, and effort discouraged excess. There is something gently humorous in imagining how little sympathy a medieval lamp would have for modern reading habits. Endless pages, continuous scrolling, long hours past midnight. The lamp would simply burn down and end the conversation. It did not care about goals or schedules. It responded only to fuel. Books themselves reflected this environment. Margins were used heavily. Notes were added not to capture fleeting thoughts, but to reduce future reading time. A well-annotated manuscript was an act of efficiency. It acknowledged that returning to a passage at night would be difficult, so clarity had to be preserved in daylight. For many households, reading aloud was more practical than reading silently. One pair of eyes strained while others listened. This shared the cost. It also reinforced the social nature of knowledge. The lamp illuminated one page, but the words reached several people. Light was saved. Understanding was multiplied. Even then, reading aloud was measured. Voices softened to match the flame. Sentences were allowed to rest between breaths. No one hurried. The night did not reward speed, and eventually the limits asserted themselves. The flame flickered, the wick shortened, the oil thinned. The reader paused longer between lines, not because the text demanded reflection, but because the eyes demanded mercy. Closing the book was not a failure. It was the expected outcome. Books did not insist on being finished at night. They waited. Paper and parchment were patient. They had endured long before this evening and would endure long after. This attitude toward reading produced a different relationship with text. Books were not portals to endless engagement. They were objects that participated in daily rhythms. They had their time, and night was only partially theirs. The medieval home understood this without resentment. Reading was valued precisely because it was limited. Its rarity preserved its importance. Night did not steal reading away. It protected it by insisting that it be treated with care. And so, when the lamp finally dimmed enough to make letters dissolve into shadow, the book was closed gently. Not with reluctance, but with trust. Tomorrow would bring light again. The words would still be there. The night had done its work, which was not to inform, but to remind everyone that even knowledge benefits from rest. Sleep came in stages. Sleep in the medieval world did not arrive as a single event and then politely remain until morning. It came in portions, like everything else, shaped by limited light and practical necessity. People did not fall asleep once and disappear for 8 uninterrupted hours. They slept early, woke briefly, and then slept again, not because of insomnia or anxiety, but because this rhythm fit the night as it actually existed. The first sleep began soon after darkness settled fully indoors. Once the lamp was extinguished and the hearth reduced to its safest glow, there was little reason to remain awake. The body did not argue. Physical labor had already done its work. Muscles softened, breathing slowed. Sleep arrived easily without negotiation, as a natural continuation of the day rather than a struggle to escape it. This first sleep was deep and unambitious. It did not aspire to restoration or productivity. It simply took advantage of the darkness while it was thick and uninterrupted. People sank into it quickly, wrapped in shared warmth, surrounded by familiar sounds, the house quiet enough to let rest feel complete. Then, some hours later, the body surfaced. The waking that followed was not abrupt. It did not involve alarm or urgency. Eyes opened slowly. Awareness returned gently. The room was still dark, perhaps darker than before, and entirely unchanged. This was not morning pretending to be night. It was night continuing its work. This waking period was short and calm. People did not rush to do things because there was nothing obvious to do. There was no light to support activity and no expectation that something should happen. You woke because the body had rested enough for now, not because the day demanded attention. During this interval, people existed rather than acted. They shifted positions. They adjusted blankets. They listened. Sometimes they spoke quietly, not to begin a conversation, but to acknowledge presence. Sometimes they lay still and allowed thoughts to pass without following them anywhere. There is a quiet irony in how unproductive this waking was by modern standards. No one felt compelled to fill it. No one interpreted it as wasted time. The concept of using every waking moment efficiently had little meaning in a world where efficiency belonged to daylight. If prayer or reflection occurred, it was simple and unstructured, shaped more by habit than by obligation. More often there was nothing at all, just awareness and darkness, just the body noticing itself. This interval did not last long. Without light to hold attention, wakefulness lost momentum. The body did not remain alert out of boredom or stimulation. It drifted naturally back toward rest, as if sleep were not something you entered once, but something you visited repeatedly. The second sleep followed more lightly. Dreams were different. The mind moved differently. This sleep carried people closer to morning, bridging the long stretch between sunset and dawn without demanding continuity. The house supported this rhythm without comment. Sounds remained minimal. Movement was careful. No one assumed that waking meant getting up. The environment made it clear that night was still in control. Children experienced this pattern without confusion. Waking briefly did not frighten them because it was familiar. Darkness was not new. Silence was not threatening. They learned that waking did not always require response. Sometimes it simply required patience. From a modern perspective, this fragmented sleep is often misunderstood as broken or inferior. In its original context, it was neither. It was adaptive. It fit the structure of the night, the limits of light, and the demands of the following day. There is gentle humor in imagining how little concern medieval sleepers would have had for optimizing rest. They did not measure sleep quality. They did not track cycles. They slept when the night allowed and woke when the body suggested it was time. This rhythm also reduced anxiety around waking. Waking in the night was not interpreted as failure. It did not mean something was wrong. It meant the night had phases and the body recognized them. Modern sleep often carries pressure. Medieval sleep carried acceptance. You slept, you woke, you slept again. No narrative was required. As morning approached, the second sleep thinned. The body sensed light before it appeared. Sounds outside shifted. The house prepared itself quietly for activity. Waking at dawn felt natural, not abrupt, because the night had already released its hold gradually. This staged sleep did not fragment life. It structured it. It divided the long night into manageable sections, each serving a purpose without announcing itself as such. The medieval home did not demand that sleep be continuous to be successful. It only demanded that it be sufficient. And sufficiency was achieved not through optimization, but through alignment with darkness. In this way, sleep mirrored every other aspect of life by oil lamp. It respected limits. It moved slowly. It did not insist on perfection. It simply worked night after night without requiring anyone to explain it or improve it. And when morning finally arrived, it did not interrupt something fragile. It continued something that had already been unfolding gently in stages, proving once again that the night did not need to be conquered. It only needed to be lived through, patiently, one quiet phase at a time. Fire as companion, not entertainment. Fire in a medieval home was not invited for its beauty. It was welcomed for its reliability. By nightfall, the flame was no longer a tool of transformation, no longer a roaring force that cooked, boiled, and reshaped raw materials. It became something quieter and far more serious. It became a companion whose job was to stay alive without drawing attention to itself. During the day, fire worked hard. It consumed large pieces of wood, demanded feeding, and announced its presence with sound and movement. At night, that version of fire was unnecessary and dangerous. The house did not need spectacle. It needed continuity. And continuity required restraint. The evening hearth was kept small on purpose, not because fuel was scarce, though it often was, but because excess flame introduced risk. A large fire produced more light, more heat, and more temptation to linger awake. It also produced sparks, smoke, and the possibility that something would go wrong while everyone else was growing tired. None of these outcomes were desirable. A quiet fire did not compete with the night. It cooperated with it. It offered warmth without insisting on attention. It allowed the house to remain visible enough to be safe, while dark enough to encourage rest. There was an understanding that fire did not need to be impressive to be useful. In fact, impressiveness was a warning sign. A hearth that burned too brightly suggested carelessness or impatience. It suggested someone was pushing the night instead of letting it pass. The medieval relationship with fire was built on respect rather than fascination. People knew exactly what fire could do when left unchecked. Stories of homes lost, stored grain ruined, and entire streets damaged by careless flames circulated quietly without needing embellishment. Fire did not need myth to make its point. At night, the hearth was treated almost like a sleeping animal. It was settled carefully, banked with ash, and given just enough fuel to last without awakening. The goal was not to extinguish it completely, which would invite cold and inconvenience in the morning, but to calm it. A controlled ember was worth more than a lively blaze. This required skill. Keeping a fire alive but subdued was not effortless. It demanded attention earlier in the evening, while eyes were still sharp and hands steady. Logs were positioned deliberately. Ash was arranged to insulate rather than smother. This was quiet labor. invisible to anyone who only noticed the result. Once established, the fire was left alone. There was no reason to poke it or admire it. Watching flames was a luxury activity associated with daylight or communal gatherings. At night, watching fire meant staying awake longer than necessary and increasing the chance of error. There is a subtle humor in how unimpressed medieval knights would have been by the modern idea of a cozy fire meant to be enjoyed visually. In a low-ceilinged room filled with wood and straw, a fire that demanded attention was not cozy. It was suspicious. The hearth's light was uneven and unreliable, which suited it perfectly. It illuminated movement rather than detail. It softened faces. It turned the room into a space of suggestion rather than clarity. This was safer than brightness, which invited confidence without reducing risk. Fire also dictated behavior indirectly. People positioned themselves around it not to admire the flames, but to share warmth efficiently. Bodies formed practical clusters. Distance was measured by comfort rather than preference. No one sat far from the hearth out of aesthetic choice. Children learned early that fire was not a toy, not because of lectures, but because the house responded quickly to mistakes. A spark on dry material demanded immediate correction. The environment enforced seriousness without explanation. As the night deepened, the fire became quieter still. Its role shifted from active presence to background assurance. It was there if needed, but it asked for nothing. This allowed the house to relax into darkness without becoming cold or unsafe. There is something deeply calming about this restrained use of fire. It acknowledged both human need and human limitation. Fire was powerful, but power did not require display. It required control. From a modern perspective, the absence of fire as entertainment might feel like a loss. In its original context, it was a form of wisdom. Night was not the time to play with elements that could end everything while people slept. The medieval home understood that survival depended not on mastery, but on moderation. Fire that burned too brightly at night was not a comfort. It was a risk that no one needed. And so the hearth glowed faintly, steady and contained, doing its quiet work. It warmed the room just enough. It marked the center of the home without demanding admiration. It accompanied the household through the night not as a spectacle, but as a promise that warmth would still be there in the morning, provided no one asked for more than it could safely give. Clothing, blankets, and shared warmth. Nighttime clothing in a medieval home did not exist to look different from daytime clothing. It existed to behave differently. What mattered after sunset was not appearance, but insulation, familiarity, and the ability to stay warm without demanding fuel or attention. Clothing shifted roles quietly as the light faded, moving from public usefulness to private survival. Day garments were often loosened rather than replaced. Layers were rearranged, sleeves adjusted, belts relaxed. Nothing was wasted. Nothing dramatic happened. The body simply prepared itself for stillness. Fabrics that had absorbed warmth during the day were kept close. Wool, linen, and fur were valued less for elegance than for how reliably they trapped heat without requiring motion. Night clothes were softer, heavier, and less concerned with structure. They did not need to hold a shape because the body beneath them would not be moving much. Tightness was unnecessary. Comfort was practical. The goal was not sleep as a luxury experience, but sleep as a stable state that did not leak warmth into the room. Blankets played a central role, but they were not the uniform items we imagine today. They varied in thickness, age, and texture. Some were patched repeatedly. Some were shared between several people. Their value was not aesthetic consistency, but accumulated warmth. A blanket that had been used for years held heat differently, almost cooperatively, as if it remembered its purpose. Shared warmth was not optional, it was assumed. Sleeping alone was a privilege or a risk, depending on context, but rarely the norm. Bodies were efficient sources of heat, and medieval households understood this without embarrassment or commentary. Privacy in the modern sense required space and resources that most people did not possess and did not miss. Sleeping spaces were collective by design. Beds were shared by family members, apprentices, servants, or travelers, depending on the household. Floor sleeping was common, often close to the hearth or near others. The idea that sleep required isolation would have seemed impractical at best and wasteful at worst. This closeness did not imply constant intimacy. It implied cooperation. Bodies arranged themselves for warmth rather than conversation. Positions were adjusted silently. Everyone understood the unspoken rules. Do not disturb unnecessarily. Do not steal blankets. Do not move in ways that disrupt shared heat. Children learned these patterns early. They grew accustomed to the presence of others in sleep. Breathing, shifting, and occasional murmurs were normal background conditions. Silence was not expected. Stillness was relative. There is a gentle irony in how much modern discomfort comes from isolation rather than closeness. Medieval sleepers did not interpret proximity as intrusion. It was reassurance. Warmth proved that others were there. Shared heat confirmed continuity. Night clothing reflected this collective logic. Garments were layered to complement shared blankets, not replace them. Too much individual insulation reduced the efficiency of shared warmth. Balance mattered. The group adjusted together, often without words. The materials themselves mattered deeply. Wool retained warmth even when damp. Linen breathed enough to prevent discomfort. Fur, where available, was used strategically rather than extravagantly. These were not fashion choices. They were solutions, refined over generations. There is something quietly humorous about how unimpressed medieval knights would have been by modern sleepwear marketing. Specialized garments, individual temperature control, personal bedding systems. The medieval home relied on bodies and cloth, doing what they had always done. Sleeping spaces were arranged to reduce heat loss. Low ceilings trapped warmth. Walls blocked drafts. Windows were small and shuttered. The goal was not comfort in isolation, but stability for the group. This collective environment also shaped emotional boundaries. Night was not a time for personal reinvention. It was a time for shared endurance. Dreams happened privately, but sleep happened together. From a modern perspective, this can feel intrusive. In context, it was efficient and grounding. No one lay awake worrying about being alone. Loneliness was less common at night, even when worries were plentiful. The absence of modern privacy did not erase individuality. It simply delayed it until daylight. Night belonged to the group because survival belonged to the group. As morning approached, layers shifted again. Blankets were released gradually. Clothing was reassembled. Warmth transitioned back to activity. Night clothing did not symbolize rest. It enabled it. Blankets did not represent comfort. They ensured continuity. In this way, the medieval night turned sleep into a collective project. Warmth was shared because warmth mattered. Privacy was postponed because privacy did not keep you alive. And so bodies gathered, cloth layered, breath synchronized, not out of sentimentality, but out of understanding. The night was long, fuel was limited, heat was precious. The simplest solution was the oldest one. Stay close, stay warm, let morning come on its own terms. Fear was boredom's shadow. Fear in the medieval night rarely arrived wearing a costume. It did not announce itself with sudden movement or dramatic sound. More often it appeared as a mild unease that followed monotony for too long, like a shadow that only became noticeable when there was nothing else left to look at. The darkness itself was not frightening. It was familiar to the point of dullness, and it was that dullness that sometimes unsettled the mind. People who lived by oil lamp did not spend their nights imagining monsters. Darkness had been present since childhood. It had never surprised them. The walls, the furniture, the sounds of the house were all known quantities. What unsettled them occasionally was the stretch of time with nothing to do and no light to interrupt thought. When the body stayed awake longer than the environment intended, the mind wandered. Without tasks, without stimulation, without variation, thoughts repeated themselves. Small worries expanded slightly, not because they were important, but because there was nothing competing with them. Fear grew not from threat, but from attention. This fear was subtle. It did not demand response. It simply suggested that staying awake was unpleasant. That suggestion was usually enough. The medieval night did not reward curiosity about anxiety. It offered no distraction. It quietly encouraged sleep as the most efficient solution. There is an irony here that modern storytelling often misses. A night that is truly dangerous does not feel boring. It feels urgent. Medieval nights were not urgent. They were predictable. And predictability, stretched too long, created discomfort not through danger, but through repetition. The absence of stimulation also meant the absence of reassurance. In daylight, effort reassured. Work created purpose. At night, purpose was suspended. The mind, unused to being idle, occasionally reacted by inventing tension. This tension did not escalate into narrative. It remained a background hum. People understood this instinctively. They did not interpret unease as a sign that something was wrong. They interpreted it as a sign that it was time to stop being awake. Fear was not a warning of monsters. It was a reminder of limits. This is why medieval households did not linger in the dark unnecessarily. They did not challenge the night to entertain them. They accepted its terms. When boredom began to sharpen into discomfort, sleep followed naturally, not as escape, but as closure. Children experienced this as well. A child awake too long after dark did not imagine elaborate threats. They grew restless. They shifted. They wanted the night to end. Adults did not need to explain fear. The body communicated it clearly. There is a gentle humor in how unimpressed medieval fear would be by modern horror. Loud noises, sudden reveals, elaborate suspense. Medieval unease did not require production. It required time and stillness. The familiar creak of wood, repeated too often, could become irritating rather than alarming. A shadow that had always been there might suddenly draw attention, not because it changed, but because the mind had nothing else to occupy itself. Fear did not grow from novelty. It grew from stagnation. This also meant that fear rarely escalated. Without light, without imagination fueled by spectacle, it had nowhere to go. It remained mild, almost boring in itself. People did not spiral. They slept. From this perspective, fear functioned as a behavioral regulator. It discouraged extended wakefulness without punishment. It did not terrorize. It nudged. It suggested that staying awake was inefficient. Modern environments remove boredom and then amplify fear. Medieval environments did the opposite. They removed stimulation and allowed fear to dissolve into sleep. The night did not invite confrontation. It invited surrender. Not surrender to fear, but surrender to rest. Fear lost its power when it had no audience. By morning, whatever unease had existed dissolved without explanation. It was not remembered as an event. It was remembered, if at all, as discomfort that resolved itself. This kind of fear did not shape stories or myths. It shaped habits. It taught people not to push the night beyond its purpose. The medieval home did not frame fear as something to be conquered. It framed it as a signal that the body and mind were misaligned with the hour. The solution was simple and repeatable. Lie down. Close your eyes. Let the darkness finish what it started. In this way, fear never became a defining feature of the night. It remained a faint companion to boredom, noticeable only when someone ignored the quiet instructions of the environment. And so the night continued doing what it always did. It reduced stimulation. It flattened drama. It made fear uninteresting. And in making it uninteresting, it made sleep the most reasonable and appealing choice available. Why homes slept early. A medieval home did not sleep early because someone told it to. It was not obeying a rule, a sermon, or a written instruction about proper behavior. It slept early because the logic of survival quietly insisted on it, night after night, until the habit no longer felt like a decision at all. Sleep was not framed as virtue. It was framed as preparation. When darkness settled fully indoors, the house had already completed most of what it could reasonably do. Work that required light was finished. Food had been eaten. Fire had been reduced to something manageable. The lamp, if it was still burning at all, was already shrinking toward its end. There was no moral drama in the sequence. It was simply the day reaching its natural conclusion. Tomorrow mattered more than tonight. That was the unspoken rule that governed medieval evenings, not because people were unusually disciplined or future-minded, but because tomorrow was unavoidable. Fields would still need attention. Animals would still need care. Water would still need carrying. Fatigue accumulated quietly, and every unnecessary hour awake made the next day harder in ways that could not be corrected once morning arrived. Saving oil tonight was not a symbolic act. It was a measurable one. Oil not burned would still exist tomorrow. A wick not shortened would last longer. A lamp not emptied would still be useful when daylight returned. These were small savings, but they added up in a world where margins were narrow and recovery options limited. The house understood this arithmetic even when no one articulated it. Its rhythms encouraged early sleep without demanding it. Light became less cooperative. Fire became quieter. Sounds softened. The environment gently withdrew support for wakefulness until staying awake felt mildly foolish rather than admirable. There is a quiet irony in how modern culture often frames early sleep as restraint or self control. In the medieval home, it was simply alignment. Staying awake late did not feel rebellious, it felt inefficient. The night did not offer enough in return to justify the cost. This also meant that no one needed to enforce bedtime. There were no rules about when the house must fall silent. Silence arrived on its own, conversation thinned, movements slowed. The body recognized the moment long before the mind needed to explain it. Children learned this rhythm without instruction. They did not resist sleep because the environment did not invite resistance. There was nothing to miss. Darkness offered no alternative activities worth staying awake for. Sleep did not compete with entertainment. It replaced absence. Adults experienced the same thing. Fatigue was not framed as weakness. It was expected. The body's request for rest was not negotiated. It was answered. There is also something gently humorous about how little drama accompanied this surrender. No one lay awake struggling with thoughts of productivity or guilt. The night did not ask questions about ambition. It did not care what you planned to accomplish someday. It only cared whether you would be functional tomorrow. The medieval home was deeply pragmatic about time. Daylight was valuable because it allowed action. Night was valuable because it allowed recovery. Mixing the two carelessly made both worse. This separation created a stable rhythm that did not need constant adjustment. People did not experiment with different sleep schedules. They did not optimize. They followed the light, and the light was consistent enough to be trusted. There is a misconception that early sleep implied boredom or lack of imagination. In reality, it implied respect for limits. Limits were not resented, they were integrated. The house itself participated in this decision. Once everyone lay down, movement stopped, sounds faded, fire settled. The structure grew still. The building slept alongside its occupants, holding warmth, blocking wind, and conserving what little energy it could. This collective sleep mattered. One person staying awake did not merely affect themselves, it consumed shared resources. It introduced noise, it disturbed warmth. Early sleep was a communal agreement enforced gently by circumstance rather than rule. From a modern perspective, this might feel restrictive. In its own time, it felt stabilizing. The predictability of rest allowed predictability of work. The predictability of work allowed survival. There was no expectation the night should be memorable. It was not a canvas for identity or expression. It was a pause designed to be unremarkable. And that unremarkableness was its strength. When dawn arrived, it did not interrupt anything precious. It continued a process that had been unfolding naturally. Bodies rose gradually. The house reactivated. The saved oil became useful again. The rested muscles did their work without complaint. Early sleep did not make medieval life small. It made it sustainable. It prevented exhaustion from accumulating faster than recovery. It kept errors rare and manageable. The night did not demand heroics. It demanded restraint. And restraint, practiced nightly, kept the household intact. So the medieval home slept early, not because it believed in early sleep as an ideal, but because the future depended on it in very ordinary ways. Tomorrow needed energy. Tomorrow needed light. Tomorrow needed people who were not unnecessarily tired. Saving oil tonight was not about caution. It was about continuity. One more day lived competently was worth more than one more hour spent awake in the dark. And so the house surrendered to sleep without argument, not because sleep was sacred, but because waking had already done enough. Conclusion. When the medieval house finally surrendered to the night, it did not do so with ceremony or meaning attached. There was no sense of an ending worth remembering. The lamp went out, the fire settled, bodies lay still, and that was enough. What we often miss, looking back, is how intentional this simplicity was. The night was not designed to inspire, frighten, or entertain. It was designed to pass safely. Everything about Life by Oil Lamp pointed toward that goal. Use less, move slower, expect little, preserve what matters for tomorrow. The medieval home did not imagine itself as fragile, yet it behaved carefully. It understood that survival was not secured through intensity, but through repetition. The same quiet choices made every evening added up to something resilient. A house that slept early did not dream of greatness. It prepared for continuity. In that sense, the night was never the opposite of the day. It was its partner. Day spent energy. Night protected it. Day demanded effort. Night refused excess. Together, they formed a rhythm that required no explanation. Perhaps that is the quiet lesson left behind. Not that the past was darker, harsher, or simpler, but that it accepted limits without argument. The night did not need to be filled. It needed to be respected. And so the house slept, not to escape the dark, but to let it do its quiet work